Okay, so attempts to fix the Hebrew text. People don't realize we don't have the original documents of the original Hebrew. It was changed over and fixed. Attempts to copy it from one region to another, we found different discrepancies of which text is proper. Well, the Hebrew Bible, the overall Bible itself, has more attested to itself by its endeavors for the scholars over the ages to fix the errors and get back to what the original text represents and translate it into the ancient Hebrew, from the ancient Hebrew to transformed Aramaic type text, which is more easily to be discerned, and added vowel markings for pronunciation so that those beyond the generation of the text's life can figure out what the context is. Some writings, some languages are not very discernible because you have to be alive, had to have been alive when the events that they wrote about occurred. And after that, it becomes very foggy, especially when the writings, the papers and the papyrus and the other stones and so on, they become unavailable or smudged, destroyed in part, so we don't know what the rest of the message is. And sometimes you need the whole paragraph or the whole page or the whole book to figure out where it's going. So the veneration shown for the canonical writings during this period naturally led to a greater care and treatment of them, and above all to perception of the necessity of critically fixing the text so that people of other generations can figure out what is being said. As soon as the ancient writings obtained canonical authority, they were used in divine service and became the standard of doctrine and life. The necessity of having one standard text naturally asserted itself. That's just logical. For other generations to be able to understand what was written. The preparation of such a text began with the law, and the other two divisions, the prophets and the hagiographa, became authoritative only in the course of centuries. And naturally their text did not receive attention in the earlier period. Oops. However, criticism during that period was of little value. There is no doubt that faithful and correct copies existed, especially of such books as were publicly read, but this could not prevent errors and mistakes from creeping into copies which were generally circulated. When Josephus, Philo speak of the great care bestowed by the Jews upon their sacred writings, this cannot be referred to earlier centuries and concerns more the contents than the linguistic minutiae of the text. The oldest critical documents, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, the Greek translation in about the 2nd or 3rd century BC, there is evidence about 500 to 100 BC to show that manuscripts most approved and most widely diffused contain many verbal differences. And these variations are not to be charged, as was formerly done to carelessness or willfulness on the part of the Hellenistic Jews and Samaritans, but are explained by the lesser importance attached to the exact uniformity of text and to the existence of mistakes in the current copies. So when the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch agree in good readings, and still oftener in bad ones, against the Masoretic text, it may be concluded that these readings were spread by many copies current among the Palestinian Jews, and are therefore not to be regarded as offensive. But after the destruction of Jerusalem, when Judaism was subject to the authority of the rabbis, it became possible to prepare a uniform standard text, and although this idea was not realized until many generations had worked upon it, so the Greek versions of the 2nd century had already fewer variations from the Masoretic text. Still nearer, the latter text is the Hebrew text of Origen and Jerome. So we have many documents to refer to sift through, to find out what the accurate text is, so we can be very confident with all of this that we have an accurate text and the translations themselves. The Talmud itself bears witness by the agreement of its biblical quotations with the Masoretic text. That the consonantal text was practically finished before the Talmudic era was closed, it is not possible to say upon what principles the text was treated, by the way in which the custodians presented the individuality of the several authors' books and periods is remarkable, and proves that intentional and arbitrary changes of the text were not made by these critics. That they changed passages for dogmatic, especially for anti-Christian reasons, as has sometimes been asserted, has long ago been acknowledged to be a baseless accusation. Where they mention changes, they make clear that they followed the testimony of manuscripts, the number of which was probably not very great. The fact that in the first centuries after Christ the text approximates our present Masoretic reading shows that a certain recension became authoritative, which was possible only after a certain manuscript had been taken as the norm. Of such a standard codex, copies could easily be made, or one could correct his own copies in accordance with it. Scholars like Oleson and Lagarde speak therefore, of some such archetype, which was slavishly followed in every respect. The critical apparatus of the time is concealed in disassociated fragments in the later Masorah, but cannot be separated from the other matter. The Talmud and the older Midrashim allow little insight into the critical efforts of the time. Thus mention is made of the corrections of the scribes and the removals of the scribes, meaning that in 5 passages are falsely introduced and was removed, and of the points in the Hebrew text over certain words to show that these words were critically suspected, such as the inverted nun in Numbers 10:35, and 3 kinds of readings: read but not written, written but not read, and read one way but written another. The 3 kinds of reading have, it is true, for the most part only exegetical value. They give the usual instead of the unusual grammatical forms, show where one must understand or omit a word, or where the reader should use a euphemistic expression for the course one in the text. They are therefore scholarly upon the text. It is possible that these readings are also fragments of the critical apparatus. However this may be, it is evident that at that period the text was fixed, and that the matter in question concerned only subordinate details of the text. So there's the detailed, exhaustive approach, and it started out, and over the years has been refined to the point where we have confidence and we can look at and read. Word divisions, divisions into verses, sections. And we have the Masoretic period, which is more refinement. The third period of the textual history is usually reckoned as extending from 6th until the 11th Christian century. Lots of centuries to go and fix things. So they spent a lot of time doing it, and they were methodical about it, very methodical. Let's take a look. I think we've gone through enough of this to see how detailed it was. Pay attention, not like any other work. Post-Masoretic period. No essential change was made in the text. Apparently he's done a good job. Let's go back. All right, take a look. We're looking for Josh McDowell's. Here it is. Old Testament Manuscript Evidence. A great book to get. I have a copy of it on my shelf. I don't have many books anymore. I usually use my laptop and electronic versions of things. This is a great book. Go get it. And doesn't go into as much detail as you don't really need, but the conclusions are good. In the case of the Old Testament, we do not have the abundance of close MS manuscript authority as in the New Testament until the recent discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The oldest complete extant Hebrew text was around 900 AD. This made a time gap of 1,300 years. If no other evidence were available, the case of the fidelity of the Masoretic text could be brought to rest with confidence based upon textual comparisons and an understanding of the extraordinary Jewish scribal system. But with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, beginning in 1947, there's almost overwhelming substantiation of the received Hebrew text of the Masoretes. Critics of the Masoretic text charge that the manuscripts were few and late. Through the Dead Sea Scrolls, Early manuscript fragments provided a check on nearly the whole Old Testament. Those checks date about 1,000 years before the great Masoretic manuscript of the 10th century. Before the discoveries in the Cairo, Genesha, and the Dead Sea caves, the Nash Papyrus, a fragment of the Ten Commandments and Shema, dated between 150 and 100 BC, was the only known scrap of Hebrew text dating from before the Christian era. But with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a number of Old Testament manuscripts have been found which scholars date before the time of Christ. When the facts are known and compared, there is an overwhelming evidence and abundance of reasons for believing that the MSS we possess are trustworthy. We shall see, as Sir Frederick Kenyon put it, that the Christian can take the whole Bible in his hand and say without fear or hesitation that what he holds in it is the true Word of God, handed down without essential loss from generation to generation throughout the centuries. This wasn't just a one-time effort. This is done through the centuries. In order to see the uniqueness of the Scripture and its reliability, one needs to examine with extreme care in which the copyist transcribed the Old Testament MSS, manuscript evidence. So we have various rabbis and other places, the scribes, and they've spent decades and decades and centuries working on the same thing, and we have today something we have confidence in. During this period of time, a great deal of time was spent cataloging Hebrew civil and canonical law. So they were intricate checks and balances here. We talk about the Talmudists themselves and their procedure. Synagogue roll must be written on the skins of clean animals prepared for the particular use of the synagogue by a Jew. They must be fastened together with strings taken from clean animals. They really go down to every little detail. A certain number of columns equal throughout the entire codex. The length of each column must not extend over less than 48 or more than 16 lines. So a lot of rules to keep it consistent. Authentic copy must be the exemplar from which the transcriber ought not to, in the least, deviate. No word or letter, not even a yod, must be written from memory, the scribe not having looked at the codex before him. And between every consonant, the space of a hair or a thread must intervene. So on. To get accuracy, and of course, these documents they copied have to be around for a long time. So you have anything that they could fall apart or show inconsistency, then it becomes suspect. Why don't we have more old MSS? The very absence of ancient MSS, when the rules and accuracies of the copies are considered, confirms the reliability of the copies we have today. So even though the two copies of Isaiah discovered in Qumran Cave 1 near the Dead Sea in 1947 were 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscript previously known in AD 980, they proved to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. The 5% of variation consisted chiefly of obvious slips of the pen and variations in spelling. Even those Dead Sea fragments of Deuteronomy and Samuel, which point to a different manuscript family from that which underlies our received Hebrew text, do not indicate any differences in doctrine or teaching. They do not affect the message of revelation in the slightest. The Masoretic period, now that's them before that. Now they picked up. The Masoretes were the Jewish scholars who between AD 500 and AD 950 gave the final form to the text of the Old Testament. The destruction of the temple in AD 70, along with the dispersion of the Jews from their land, became a powerful impetus to standardize the consonantal text and standardize punctuation and the use of vowels to preserve correct vocalization and pronunciation for reading. They were called Masoretics because they preserved in writing the oral tradition the Masorah